Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we're diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Coniunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book, or a link to contact me directly so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. I also want to make note that if you are enjoying what I am doing over here, to take the time to like, share, subscribe, and to hype the video. That is a new feature that YouTube has rolled out, and it is an effective one for smaller channels like myself, and it is also free for you to support the channel. So if you don't mind spending your hype on me, I would appreciate it. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Mysterium Coniunctionis with Salt, Part C, the Red Sea. I will almost certainly step on some toes today. I am going to go ahead and refer you to the Bible study where I read aloud the Bible in 161 videos and came to discover that there is not a whole lot that you should be paying attention to in that particular book. I understand that that steps on some toes. It is not intentional. I do not apologize for it. The text says what the text says. All right, let's dive in. The Red Sea. It might almost be one of the alchemical paradoxes of the Red Sea, in contrast to the significance ordinarily attached to mare, is the term for the healing and transforming baptismal water. 465. Dogler, Antiquion Christendom. I will go ahead and point out right here, right now, that baptism is symbology. Right? It is a symbolical reference to an internal change. That is the best that it is. It is not salvific at all. Your salvation is not based upon that. If you don't believe that, then you should go and look at Christ crucified, where he was at a sinner on either side, and one of them got to go home without being dunked underneath any particular waters. Right? Now, of course, the entire Gospels are an allegory. None of that is actually true to anything, but if you believe in Christianity, you should understand that a baptismal is not necessary for the salvific process. Now, I maintain this is one of those very unconventional beliefs that nothing ever had to die for you to be forgiven from sin, that the only thing that was ever required for you to be forgiven from sin was to admit your sin, repent from your sin, and turn from your sin. That is apparent throughout the entirety of the Bible if you actually read it. I have read it. I have done it. It is there. Once again, no one had to die for you to be forgiven from sin. No animal, no human, ever. Healing and transformative baptismal waters. And again, right, baptism is only a symbol. This ring right here, this ring does not make me married. This ring is a symbol to everyone else that I am married, but this ring does not make me married. It is an outward symbol of an inward commitment, visible for other people to see. That is all baptism is as well. And thus is an equivalent of the alchemical aqua pontica. St. Augustine says, the Red Sea signifies baptism, 466. Now, tractates on the Gospel of St. John. Also, it is important to note, right? The Bible can be read as an allegory. That is perfectly fine. It should not be read as a literal historical text. There are many things that are directly contradictory within the book itself, and while it does contain some historicity, some very provable things from history, that does not mean that it is a history itself. There are things contained within it that are absolutely not. There are things contained within it that are definitely up for debate whether they happened or not. There is no real reason to believe that Moses ever existed. I know that is a step too far for some people, but I am not here for everyone, right? This channel is open to anyone. But it is not here for everyone, and if you are dogmatic about the Bible, this is not going to be the channel for you at all. Signifies baptism, 466. Tractates on the Gospel. All right. And according to Honorius of Autun, the Red Sea is the baptism reddened by the blood of Christ, in which our enemies, namely our sins, are drowned, 467. That is Speculum de Mysteries Ecclesiae. Now, as an allegory, right, you can take the Exodus as an allegory for spiritual development, and it's not a very good one, but it works kind of. As such, coming out of captivity is the beginning of self-reflection. The crossing of the Red Sea would be a doubling down on that conviction, right? And while it is symbolical of the baptism, in the allegory of, it is the submersion of the lesser, baser parts of you, symbolized by the Egyptians, and the deliverance of the upper spiritual side of you, symbolized by the Israelis. That is not a good correlation, right? But it is one that fits for the allegory. And so the allegory being here, the sins drowned, would be the baptism. That would also be the Egyptians being drowned. We must also, did I do 467? Yeah, okay. We must also mention the periodic interpretation of the Red Sea. The Red Sea drowned the Egyptians, but the Egyptians were all non-knowers. Really? Non-knowers, right? There were no Egyptian mysteries whatsoever. There was no greater understanding ever brought about by the Egyptians. Only if you read the Bible, right? According to the Bible, they were great sinners with no knowledge whatsoever. But if you read the Egyptian histories, it turns out that they had a very rich spiritual life. And while it was not following the demon that was Yahweh, they did have gods. Their concept of gods were not even necessarily terrestrial in the way that ours are. The Exodus from Egypt signifies the Exodus from the body. No, which is Egypt in miniature, being the incarnation of sinfulness and the crossing of the Red Sea is the crossing of the waters of corruption, which is chronos or time. Footnote 468 is, whence the designation periodics, a Gnostic sect. They were the transcendentalists. Right now, the Red Sea, symbolizing the water of corruption, that would be you going through the sea, doing your shadow work, trying to ascend to the higher spiritual self. And again, that's not a great allegory, but it is one that fits, right? I do not believe that you should use the Bible as the allegory, right? You can take the teachings of Christ allegorically and apply them to your life much better than you can any of the allegories that are contained within the Old Testament. Now, when we did the Bible study, it was not as an allegory, right? It was taking it as literal truth. There is a possibility that I will fall back at some time, do the Bible as an allegory, but honestly, I don't know that there is a whole lot of value to be contained in that particular study. Again, the allegory is not a great one, right? And even the law and the things that are given are not great at all. The other side of the Red Sea is the other side of creation. The arrival in the desert is a Genesis outside of generation. There are the gods of destruction and the God of salvation are all together. Agreed. 469. Hippolytus, Olentius. The Red Sea is a water of death for those that are unconscious, but for those that are conscious, it is a baptismal water of rebirth and transcendence. 470. There exists a level or threshold of consciousness which is characteristic of a definite time period or stratum of society, and which might be compared to a water level. The unconscious level rises whenever the conscious level falls, and vice versa. Anything that is not in the conscious field of vision remains invisible and forms a content of the unconscious. I do not disagree with this, but I do not believe that that is what this is talking about. Right. The Exodus from Egypt is a symbology of coming out of sin. right? Going through the Red Sea is the drowning of those sins, right? That is not necessarily conscious and unconscious, but for those who are aware that they are in this process, right, that is consciousness. If you are actively going through and doing your shadow work, balancing yourself in the way that I talk about in this book, if you are actively doing that, that is a conscious decision. That is you consciously using the waters. If you are unconscious, those are the waters of death, right? Wading into these waters without conscious intention and the perfect alignment can lead to death. That is a real thing. By unconscious are meant those who have no gnosis. Agreed, that's what I just said. An example, are not enlightened as to the nature and destiny of man in the cosmos. In modern language, it would be those who have no knowledge of the contents of the personal and collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is the shadow and the inferior function. Footnote 471. Psychological types. This is one we are definitely going to have to get into because I have an entire chapter talking about these functions and types. Now, the inferior function are going to be the ones below, right? The four lower consciousnesses. In Gnostic terms, the sinfulness and impurity that must be washed away by baptism. The collective unconscious expresses itself in the mythological teachings, characteristic of most mystery religions, which reveal the secret knowledge concerning the origin of all things and the way to salvation. Unconscious people who attempt to cross the sea without being purified and without the guidance of enlightenment are drowned. Again, I agree, right? I give you the way. This is a guidebook for this. It's not the only way. I do not claim that. But it is a way, and it is a way that does work. Take it as you will. They get stuck in the unconscious and suffer a spiritual death insofar as they cannot get beyond their one-sidedness. To do this, they would have to be more conscious of what is unconscious to them and their age, above all, of the inner opposite, namely those contents to which the prevailing views are in any way opposed. The continual process of getting to know the counterposition in the unconscious I have called the transcendent function, 472. Ibid, especially paragraph 828, the transcendent function. I have called the transcendent function because the confrontation of conscious, rational data and those that are unconscious, irrational, necessarily results in a modification of standpoint. But an alteration is possible only if the existence of the other is admitted, at least to the point of taking conscious cognizance of it. A Christian of today, for instance, is no longer ought to cling obstinately to a one-sided credo, but should face the fact that Christianity has been in a state of schism for 400 years, with the result that every single Christian has a split in his psyche. No. Okay. There is a schism. That is undoubted, right? There is the Catholic Church and all of the varieties of Protestantism that has arisen from that. But that does not necessarily mean that there is a split in psyche, right? A split in psyche would mean that you followed both of those, right? You were both a Baptist and a Catholic. That would be a split in the psyche. That would be a misunderstanding of that schism. We are fully aware, I say we because I used to be a Christian, right? And when I made the decision to not be Catholic, it was with the full awareness that there was a schism, that these beliefs aligned closer to what I believed than anything that the Catholic Church purports. The Catholic Church has very little to do with any of the teachings of Jesus. If that steps on your toes, you should fall back to the teachings of Jesus. But this does not mean that there is a split in the psyche. This is you not having that understanding, right? This is you with the predetermination that you were raised Catholic. Anything that is schism from the Catholic means that there is a split in the psyche. That is not the same thing. That is not even in accordance. Naturally, this lesion cannot be treated or healed if everyone insists on his own standpoint. Right? And again, that is a fundamental problem with Christianity, is that there is no clear definitives. Right? It tells you, upon this rock I will build my church, and yet we don't have anything of Peter contained in the church. I know, that's going to set somebody off, but again, fall back to the book. Most of the understanding that we have of the divine comes from the letters, right? That is where most of it comes from. That is the most of the New Testament. And most of the New Testament letters were written by someone who never actually met Jesus at all. Paul, right? Paul never met Jesus. He had an experience that was spiritual, that he identified with Jesus, but that is not the same as meeting Jesus. It might be, it is possible, but it is not likely. It is not likely because the things that Paul taught were directly in opposition to everything that anyone that actually studied with Jesus taught. It was in direct opposition in a multitude of ways. Whenever you read through the letters, and it's not a letter from Paul and it's talking about the other apostle that they are in contention with, they are talking about Paul. There was direct conflict between the 11 surviving apostles and the teachings of Paul. You cannot reconcile those two. That is an intrinsic problem with Christianity, and that is what leads to this, right? That type of stuff is exactly what is the problem. You have one apostle saying it doesn't matter what you eat, and then you have another apostle saying the law will not be abolished and you are condemned if you eat pork. That is two completely separate understandings from the same book. There are a multitude of those directly contradictory statements as doctrine. And so it is perfectly understandable why there is a schism. And that is not even getting into any of the problems with the Old Testament, which is a lot. There are a lot of problems with the Old Testament. I do not apologize for them. I read them as they were written without a lens of I'm going to correct what is stated in accordance with what I have been taught. I'm just going to take what it says. That's what the Bible study is. And the very first video that is in that playlist, right, which will be linked right here in Unconventional Bible Study, the first video is why the Bible cannot be an authority. I go into extensive detail, not pulling the sources, but merely talking about the lessons learned for a lot of those problems. I don't know that I even got into the New Testament in that video. It was all the Old Testament, and there were a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of directly contradictory material. But one of the major ones, major problem, there is no prophecy of a virgin birth. That is not a thing that is contained in the Old Testament. That is a completely misunderstood prophecy from Isaiah, which was spoken and fulfilled in the lifetime of the prophet, with no intention that there would be another interpretation of that several thousand years later. If that is a problem for you, you will not enjoy the rest of this study, but you should definitely fall back to the Bible study. Back to the text. Behind those barriers, he can rejoice in his absolute and consistent convictions and deem himself above the conflict. But outside of them, he keeps the conflict alive by his intransience and continues to deplore the pig-headedness and stiff-neckedness of everybody else. It seems as if Christianity had been, from the outset, a religion of chronic squabblers. Didn't I just say that? I'm pretty sure I just said that. And even now, does everything in its power never to let the squabbles rest. Remarkably enough, it never stops preaching the gospel of neighborly love, even when it is killing anyone who is a neighbor that does not agree, right? Christianity is spread by the sword, either intrinsically by cutting off heads of those that disagreed, or implicitly by telling you that I would cut off your head if you do not agree. That is how Christianity spread across the entirety of Europe. Don't believe that? Go find a druid to talk to. You don't believe that? Come to the New World and visit any of the missions by which they eradicated several, like, genocide of culture on a massive scale here, right? All of the native peoples had their beliefs taken from them by the Catholic Church upon pain of death. Back to the text. We should get along a lot better if we realize that the majority views of others are condoned by a minority in ourselves. Armed with this psychological insight, which today no longer has the character of a revelation, since common sense can grasp it, we could set out on the road of the union of opposites, and would then, as in the periodic doctrine, come to a place where the gods of destruction and the gods of salvation are together. That is what I talk about, right? When it is talking about the union of the opposites, to me, it is talking about the balancing of these 7 virtues and 7 vices through these 7 chakras that are intrinsic and internal to you, and projecting that energy out into the one extra that is outside of you, that is composed of both the light and the darkness. And so, for me, this God of destruction and God of salvation, that would be destruction with the white, penetrative, masculine part, and salvation would be the feminine, generative, negative, black part. But those two coming together through the union of opposites is exactly what I talk about in here. That is fully acknowledging my confirmation bias. By this is obviously meant the destructive and constructive power of the unconscious. This coincidentia oppositorium forms a parallel to the messianic state of fulfillment described in Isaiah 11:6 and 35:5, though with one important difference. The place of Genesis outside of generation, presumably in opus contra naturam, is clearly not paradise, but the desert and the wilderness. Now, I do not know what these specific quotations are. I am not going to go look them up, but it's probably a misunderstanding. Everyone who becomes conscious of even a fraction of his unconscious gets outside of his own time and social stratum into a kind of solitude, as our text remarks. But only there is it possible to meet the God of salvation. Light is manifest in the darkness, and out of the danger the rescue comes. In his sermon on Luke 19:12, Meister Eckhart says, "And who can be nobler than the man who has borne half of the highest and best the world has to offer, and half of the innermost grounds of God's nature and God's loneliness? Therefore the Lord speaks in the prophet Hosea, I will lead the noble souls into the wilderness and speak into their hearts, one with the one from the one, and into the one, itself the one, eternally." 473. C.F. Evans' translation, this passage refers to Hosea 13:5. I didn't know thee in the wilderness, and then in the land of great drought. That is not the same thing as this. It's not, right? He says, I did know thee in the wilderness and in the land of great drought. Okay, God knows you wherever you are. I will lead the noble souls into the wilderness is not saying that I knew you in the wilderness. That is a completely different understanding. And speak into the hearts. One will with the one from the one, and one into the one itself eternally, right? Now, that could be the wilderness within yourself through which you have to come out, and he knew you in the wilderness. But that is not leading you into the wilderness. That is guiding you from the wilderness. This is not a one-on-one correlation with what is recorded in the footnote at all. But this one with the one, that is what I talk about. One from the one, again, what I talk about. And in the one itself, the one eternally, is again what I talk about. If that is confusing to you, the divine in the Trinity explained, talks about this. The one is God. God is all. God before existed, or before the beginning, there was God, and God was infinite and without form. The one. And God decided to create and limited himself from the infinite into the finite, still the one, but the one limited into the spirit, which is a definition that can be placed upon God because he has limited himself into the finiteness of creation. That set into motion is the logos, right? Not any one person ever at any point in time, but all of this in the one, from the one, in the one itself, is exactly in accordance with chapter 1 of my book. I have gone into this Hippolytus text at some length because the Red Sea was of special significance to the alchemist. Sermo 32 of the Turba mentions the Tyrian dye, which is extracted from our most pure Red Sea. It is the parallel of the Tinctura philosophorum, which is described as black and is extracted from the sea. 474. That is a reference to Turba. The old treatise, Rosinus ad Ethiciem, says, "And know that our Red Sea is more tincturing than all seas, and that the poison, when it is cooked and becomes foul and discolored, penetrates all bodies." 475, 476. 475 is venenium, is a synonym for the tincture. 476 is a reference to another book. Right. Now, this would be the Red Sea as coming out of, right, tincturing all the seas, and that the poison, when it is cooked and becomes fouled and discolored, penetrates all bodies. Right? Allegory. The tincture is the dip and the baptismal water of the alchemist, here asserted to come from the Red Sea. This idea is understandable in view of the patristic and Gnostic interpretation of the Red Sea as the blood of Christ, in which we are baptized. He was baptized in the Jordan, so hence the paralleling of the tincture, salt, and aqua pontica, the blood. 477. 477 is the Gloria Mundi. In the work, it becomes like unto the blood. Now, as far as I am aware, there is not a reference to anyone being baptized in salt water. Right? You've got the Jordan, which is really close to the Dead Sea, which would be a much better representative of salt than the Red Sea would be. Much better. But it was in the fresh, free-flowing waters of the Jordan, which Jesus was baptized, and everybody else that is referenced as baptized was also done in the river. None of them were done in the salt water. Now, that is not to say that other people don't do that, but in the Bible, there is not a single reference to that, especially not the Red Sea, which was a considerable distance away from Israel. Across an entire desert, right? You had to pass through the Negev and then the wilderness and then get to Egypt. The Red Sea appears in a very peculiar manner in the Tractus Aristotelis and Alexandra Magnum, where a recipe says, "Take the serpent and place it in the chariot with 4 wheels, and let it be turned about on the earth until it is immersed in the depths of the sea, and nothing more is visible but the blackest Dead Sea. And there let the chariot with the wheels remain, until so many fumes rise up from the serpent that the whole surface, planetes, becomes dry, and by desiccation sandy and black. All that is the earth, which is no earth, but a stone lacking all weight. And when the fumes are precipitated in the form of rain, you should bring the chariot from the water to dry land, and then you will place the 4 wheels upon the chariot, and will obtain the result, if you will advance further to the Red Sea, running without running, motion without motion." 478. The rest of the title is, in Latin, written of old and gathered together by a certain Christian philosopher. Right. Now this can be symbolically written physical alchemy, right? This is talking about taking a specific thing and doing a specific thing to it. I do not have the key for the serpent, or the earth or the sea or any of that for physical alchemy, right? Just off the top, this even almost certainly is talking about that. But as an allegory, it works as well, right? But the serpent in that case is going to be the white penetrative light. Place it into the chariot with 4 wheels. There are actually 7 wheels, but okay. Right? The understanding can be lesser. That is fine. You can still get some things done, just not as effectively. And so if they only knew about 4 wheels, okay. If they knew about 5, okay. If they knew about 3, that is fine as well. In actuality, on my understanding, there are 7 primaries attached to the spinal fluid, particularly. And so for me, those are going to be the chariot. That's going to be the wheels. That is going to be the part that moves the things up and down, even from the dark to the light and the light to the dark, right? And so as an allegory, this is in somewhat accordance with what I believe. The earth, which is no earth, a stone lacking all weight, right? And when the fumes are precipitated, bringing the chariot from the water to dry land would be the process of going from the lower to the upper, right? And again, that is not a perfect allegory, but there are very few perfect allegories. It does work if you are trying to read that into it. It is not necessarily intrinsic to my understanding, but I can overlay my understanding with it. That does not mean that I am correct. And most likely, this was literally talking about physical alchemy. This curious text requires little elucidation. The serpent is the prima materia, the serpens hermetius. That would be the spirit, which he, Hermes, sent to King Antiochus, that he might do battle with thee, Alexander, and thine army, 479. Here the author adds, it is better to take pleasure in the opus than in riches or in works of virtuosity. The rare virtuosus is equivalent to the Greek evapatos. Right. The serpent being the prima materia, there is a serpent that you pull from the top and the bottom. One is light, one is dark. They are equal. They should intertwine all the way through your chakras. So for me, that absolutely does work. It does. Right. Even that which Hermes sent, that is the understanding. Fall back to the ancient lore playlist where that is explained. And so for me, this does overlay. The serpent is placed in the chariot of its vessel and is led hither and thither by the full rotation of the natures. But it should be securely enclosed. The wheels are the wheels of the elements. For me, the wheels are the chakras. The vessel, or vehicle, is the spherical tomb of the serpent. That, to me, is the encapsulating light and dark divine aura. 480. 480 is a reference to Ibid. The fourfold rotation of the natures correspond to the ancient tetrameria of the opus, its division into 4 parts. An example, transformation through the 4 elements from earth to fire. For me, again, that is going to be exactly opposite. It goes fire, air, water, earth. In my understanding, the only other understanding that would work would be air, fire, water, earth, for reasons that I have explained elsewhere, but it has to do with density and transformation. This symbolism describes in abbreviated form the essentials of the opus. The serpent of Hermes, or the agathodemon, the nous, that animates the cold part of nature, that is, the unconscious, is enclosed in the spherical vessel of diaphanous gas, which on the alchemical view represents the world and the soul. 481. In his sermon on the vessel of beaten gold, Ecclesiasticus 59, Meister Eckhart says, I have spoken a word which could be spoken of St. Augustine, or of any virtuous soul, such being likened to a golden vessel, massive and firm, adorned with every precious stone. Alright, so the nous that animates the cold part of nature, right? That is, the unconscious is going to be the spirit. The part that animates is the spirit. The part that changes is the spirit. The part that is fire, life, light, change, spirit, logos. That is intrinsic to my understanding. And so that is going to represent neither the world nor the soul. The psychologist would see it rather as a psychic reflection of the world, namely consciousness of the world and the psyche. 482. 482 says, not only the vessel must be round, but the fermarium it is heated in. The fermarium is made of firmus equinus, horse dung. That is for physical alchemy, right? Now, for me, this spherical part is literally the chakras, right? There are 7 internal spheres. They rotate oppositionally. The bottom one rotates clockwise. The next one up rotates counterclockwise. The next one up rotates clockwise. It alternates all the way up and down. The one external one rotates externally. Due to the driving force of the base and the crown working in clockwise manner, the oppositional is going to be counterclockwise. It works like a serpentine belt. Those forces that you pull both up and down weave through that like a belt. It works exactly like physics would have it work if you were to mount 7 pulleys and run a serpentine belt between them. It works exactly the same. And for me, this sphere is going to be that representative. There is a sphere on each one of these nervous centers, and there is one that encapsulates you fully. That is the sphere to me. The transformation corresponds to the psychic process of assimilation and integration by means of the transcendent function. 483. That is a reference to psychological types. This function unites the pairs of opposites, which, as alchemy shows, are arranged in quartino when they represent a totality. The totality appears in quaternary form only when it is not just an unconscious fact, but a conscious and differentiated totality when you are using it on purpose. For instance, when the horizon is thought of not simply as a circle that can be divided into any number of parts, but as consisting of 4 clearly defined points. Accordingly, one's given personality could be represented by a continuous circle, whereas the conscious personality would be a circle divided up in a definite way, and this generally turns out to be a quaternity. The quaternity of basic functions of consciousness meet this requirement. It is therefore only to be expected that the chariot should have 4 wheels. 484. 484 is from Psychology and Alchemy, to correspond with the 4 elements or natures. The chariot, as a spherical vessel and as a consciousness, rest on the 4 elements or basic functions, just as the floating island where Apollo was born. Delos, represented on the 4 supports which Poseidon made for it. The wheels naturally are on the outside of the chariot and are its motor organs, just as the functions of consciousness facilitate the relation of the psyche to the environment. It must, however, be stressed that what we today call the schema of functions is archetypically prefigured by one of the oldest patterns of order known to man, namely the quaternity, which always represents a consciously reflected and differentiated totality. Quite apart from its almost universal incidence, it also appears spontaneously in dreams as an expression of the total personality. The chariot of Aristotle can be understood in this sense as the symbol of self. And here I am going to pause for some of my own work. Contained in here, I believe it is chapter 4, Understanding Yourself. We dive into the personality types, and the way that you can differentiate those personality types is by asking 5 questions, 4 of which break it down into the quaternity, and then the 5th one makes an alternative of that determination. There are 5 primal questions, but the first 4 are this: what do you focus upon? Things or ideas? The physical corporeality or the things that are not physical, right? From that, do you focus on the old ones or the new ones? Old and new. Next is, do you do that for yourself or for the tribe? And then it is, hold on. Do you do it for yourself or for the tribe? Is it new or is it old? And are you rigid or are you flexible? Like, are you able to work around somebody else's beliefs, or does it have to be your way? These 4 main divisions break down into the 16 primary types. That is a quaternary that encompasses the entirety of thought, right? It is either towards the physical or towards the mental. It is either sorting through all of the new ones, or gathering all of the new ones, or sorting through all of the old ones. It is either for yourself or for everyone else, and it is either you doing it your way or making provision for the tribe. That is the 4 clearly defined ways of thinking. Now, the 5th element in that, which brings it from 16 to 32, that is in the delivery of the information. It is not in how you receive it or even process it, but how you give it back. And so that is the major divisions, 4 major questions, really break it down. And then the 5th one is just a minor variation upon those 4. And so for me, with what I already concur, that is going to represent the totality, right? In quite apart from the universal incidents, wait, that's the wrong part. The oldest patterns of order known to man, the quaternary, represents a consciously reflected and differentiated totality. How you differentiate the totality. Like I am in accordance with this, even if it is not the understanding that is being relayed by this. The recipe goes on to say that these symbolic vehicles should be immersed in the sea of unconscious for the purpose of heating and incubation. 486. 486 is the heating and incubation of the philosophers in the triple glass house at the bottom of the sea in the Aristotelian vision, corresponding to the state of tapas. 487. Tapas is a technical term meaning self-incubation. Brooding, the Diana state. So, going within yourself to create. Basically, right? Creating within yourself the flow of the things. Self-incubation. Incubation by means of self-heating. By this is obviously meant a state of introversion in which the unconscious content is brooded over and digested. During this operation, all relations with the outside world are broken off. The feelers of perception and intuition, discrimination and valuation are withdrawn. The 4 wheels are placed upon the chariot. Outside everything is quiet and still, but deep inside the psyche, the wheels go on turning, performing those cyclic evolutions which bring the mandala of the total personality, the ground plan of the self, to clear closer to consciousness. 488. For the psychology of the mandala, see my commentary on the Secret of the Golden Flower, paragraph 31, Psychology and Alchemy, a study in the process of individuation and concerning mandala symbolism. We have done the Secret of the Golden Flower. There is a video and a playlist available for all of it, including the commentary by Mr. Jung. You are more than welcome to check those out. It is part of this exploration, and there is some very good information to be drawn from the Secret of the Golden Flower. But so long as the consciousness has not completed the process of integration, it is covered by the blackest Dead Sea. That is the shadow work that I talk about so often. Darkened by unconsciousness and oppressed by heat, as was the hero in the belly of the whale during the night sea journey. 489. What is that talking about? Symbols of transformation. In the Aristotelian vision, which seems to be the prototype of the motif of the king in the sweat bath. Okay, I thought they were going to try and talk about Jonah for a second. I'm like, no. Through the incubation of the snake-like content is vaporized, literally sublimated, which amounts to saying that it is recognized and made an object of conscious discrimination. The evaporatio is followed by the desiccation of the surface, which then appears sandy and black. Here the imagery changes. The allusion to the subsiding flood means psychologically that the black blanket of unconsciousness hiding the nascent symbol is drawn away. That is the process of self-discovery. Arena, sand, is defined as the pure substance of the stone, 490. 490 is from Ruland Lexicon. And accordingly, the text describes the regenerated earth as a stone lacking all weight. The text does not explain why it is weightless, but it is evident that nothing material, which alone has weight, is left over, and all that remains is the psychic content of the projection. The stone that does not have weight is the philosopher's stone. It is the energetic center that is located within the heart. It is the binder together of the as below trinity, which is the base, sacral, and solar plexus, with the as above trinity, which is the crown, third eye, and throat. The binder together of the as above and the as below goes through the philosopher's stone, which is signified by green, and is you coming into concurrence with gratitude. The opus is far from having come to an end at this point, for the negretto, terra nigra, still prevails and the substance of the stone is still black. It is therefore necessary for the fumes to precipitate and wash off the blackness, whence the whole earth becomes white. The rain now falls so copiously that the earth is almost turned into a sea, hence the direction that the chariots should be brought to dry land. This is clearly another allusion to Noah's Ark and the flood. Or going through the Red Sea, 491. Remarkably enough, a 12th century representation of the four-wheeled chariot, see below, bears the inscription, "Out of the Ark of the Covenant an altar is built by the cross of Christ." That is a complete misunderstanding of everything. Right? The rain falls so copiously to the earth is almost turned into a sea. That absolutely can be Noah's Ark, right? But not in the allegory of where we started with the Red Sea, right? This would be the Red Sea. With the coming of the flood, the previous state of chaos would be restored, and the result of the opus would again be swamped by unconsciousness. This motif recurs in the form of the dragon that pursued Leto and the woman crowned with stars. If the chariot reaches dry land, this obviously means that the content has become visible and remains conscious. And then, says the text, you have placed the wheels upon the chariot, 492. 492 says, plus thurum, also denotes the chariot in the sky, Charles Wain, Ursa Major, or Big Dipper. The constellation marks the celestial pole, which was of great significance in the history of symbols. It is a model of the structure of the self. The four natures or elements are gathered together and are contained in the spherical vessel. An example, the four aspects or functions are integrated with consciousness, so that a state of totality has almost been attained. Had it really been attained, the opus would be consummated at this point, but the result, effectus, is obtained only by advancing further. The result, therefore, means something more than integration of the four natures. If we take the loading of the chariot as the conscious realization of the four functions, this does, in fact, denote only the possibility of remaining conscious of the whole previous material, that is, of the principal aspects of the psyche. The question then arises as to how all these divergent factors, previously kept apart by apparently insuperable incompatibilities, will behave and what the ego is going to do about it. The singular image of the nous serpent enthroned on a chariot reminds us of the chariot-driving snake-shaped gods of southern India. For instance, on the immense black table at Puri, which is itself a chariot of stone, it is important to remember that it is almost a certainty that many of the traditions that are recorded by the Jews in the Old Testament probably originated in India. I certainly don't want to suggest that there is any direct Indian influence on our text. I do, right? We have done the work. We went through Blavatsky twice. We did Isis Unveiled and what was the other one? There was another one by Blavatsky. We have a playlist of her works. And one of the things that we learned from that is that it is almost a certainty that many of the beliefs did indeed come from India. I certainly don't want to suggest that there is any direct Indian influence on our text, for there is another model close to hand, and that is Ezekiel's vision of the four creatures. That probably came from India as well, with the faces respectively of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. These four figures are associated with four wheels, their construction being, as it were, a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of the four directions without turning as they went. Now, you can take this as an allegory of the internal structure of these wheels that I talk about, but it is not a good one, right? I am not trying to make that correlation, right? There is a possibility that this is talking about a vessel in physicality, that there is an entity that may reside in this vessel, that may use this vessel for moving about however it needs to move about. I do not have experience with that particular thing, so I'm not going to expound upon it any further. Together, they form the moving throne of a figure having the appearance of a man. In the Kabbalah, this chariot, Merkaba, plays an important role as the vehicle on which the believers mount up to God and the human soul unites with the world soul. Now, this part, right, separate from the understanding of the Kabbalah, this Merkaba word is associated with the divine chakra in my understanding, right? Now, I can be wrong as to what that means to the Jewish people. It is my understanding that it is the same thing as the aura, as the light and dark forces, the yin and the yang. The Merkaba to me is the part that you use for the enacting of astral projection, right? That is through your internal chakras projected out into the world through your divine chakra. And then the divine chakra is what enables that to happen. So for me, this understanding is going to be the same as the divine aura. And that is indeed the way that you mount up to God and the human soul unites with the world soul. To me, that is exactly the same thing. An interpretation of the four wheels as the quadriga and the vehicle of divinity is found in a window medallion by Sugar, the 12th century maker of stained glass for the Abbey of Saint Denis. 494. 494 is a reference to another book. The chariot, which is depicted, bears the inscription Quadris Animadab, referring to the Song of Songs 6:11. My soul troubled me for the chariots of Aminadab. 495. Hold up. 494. 495. The passage is corrupt. The Hebrew original text has, my soul set me chariots of Aminadab. There are many different interpretations and conjectures, of which I will mention only Rikwa scarfs. Merkaba can also be the sun chariot. Aminadab is a king's name from Ammon, Ami, a Semitic god, here possibly transferred to sun chariot. Or, who else do we have with this particular configurations of names? Is there a link to Egypt? There is indeed a link to Egypt, right? Amun-Ra, for instance. Now, with that in mind, right? Merkaba as a chariot, soul setting me with some problems, right? My soul troubles me for the chariots of Aminadab. We're going to talk about Solomon real quick, and this one has a tendency to step on toes, but Solomon was not a good guy at all in any way, shape, or form. He tells you that quite explicitly in Ecclesiastes, and it is reiterated in the Song of Songs. But, right, one of the things that we discovered in the Bible study about Solomon in particular was eye-opening to me, right? Besides the fact that he deprived the birthright of his brothers, all of them, by killing them. That is a thing that happened. He killed all of them except for one. There was one he let live, one that could not be a king, right? Besides that fact, there is Solomon was extremely wealthy. That is one of the things that is known. He was so wealthy that he built this whole temple dedicated to something that loved blood, right? But do you know how he made his money? Do you know what his main trade was, right? That's not to say that all of his money came from there, but a good bit of it. And it is recorded in Kings and Chronicles. He got it through the trade of war, right? Through the trade of arms. He was a weapons dealer. Now, it wasn't swords, it was chariots. He went and he bought chariots from Egypt and horses, and he sold them to Babylon, and he sold them to Assyria, and he sold them to all of the surrounding regions. But did you know that there is in the Bible expressly stated by God, right, as the law, right, as it is written from God, divinely inspired, when you get into the land, which I promise you, and then you get kings, which, by the way, was something that wasn't supposed to be known, another one of those direct contradictions. But when you get into this land, and you get kings, your king is specifically prohibited from going to Egypt to buy either chariots or horses, which is how Solomon made all of his money as the third king of Israel, directly in contradiction to the express will of God. That might be a problem, seeing as how Solomon was so blessed, but he stood in direct contradiction to the direct will of God as given in the law through Leviticus. That's a problem. That's a major problem, and it's one that would fit right here with his Song of Songs, and my soul troubled me for the chariots of Amminadab. If Amminadab is indeed related back to Ammon, Ra, and that being Egypt, and him being specifically denied being able to go to Egypt to buy those two very specific things, which he then did, that might cause some soul trouble, you think? Back to the text. God the Father stands on a four-wheeled chariot holding the crucifix before him. In the corners of the medallion are the four emblems of the evangelist, the Christian continuation of Ezekiel's winged creatures. The four Gospels form, as it were, a quaternary podium on which the Redeemer stands. Still another source might be Honorius of Atum. In his commentary on Song of Songs 6:11, he says that his animalis vita, is that the same? It is the same, was troubled because the chariot signified the four evangelists. It was this chariot that the apostles and their followers had driven through the world, because they didn't go on their feet exclusively through the entirety of the mystery. For Christ had said in the Gospels, "Except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish." Luke 13:3. And it was to him, Honorius, that the words were addressed. Return, return, O Shulamite. Song of Songs 6:13. That is footnote 496. For Honorius, this naturally has the moral meaning of turn again. See his Expositio in Cantica Canti. Psychologically, the vision of Ezekiel is a symbol of the self, consisting of four individual creatures and wheels, an example of different functions. Three of the faces are theriomorphic and only one anthropomorphic, which presumably means that only one function has reached the human level, whereas the others are still an unconscious or animal state. I'm going to do another thing that I haven't done in a long time. It's been a couple of years since we discussed this particular topic. But if you are familiar at all with Chapter 4 in here, where we talk about the MBTI types, there is what is called the stack, right? And the stack is how the cognitive functions array themselves from top to bottom, right? There is, for me, I am an INFJ. That means that it is N-I-F-E, N-I-F-E-T-I-S-E. And then it goes N-E-F or N-E-F-I-T-E-S-I. There are 8. That is the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. The first 4 represents you thinking. The second 4 represents you not really thinking. But if you take that stack and you reverse it right? You flip it exactly upside down and you place them together. It represents a division of four. There is the conscious and unconscious. There is the supraconscious, which is outside of yourself, attaining to the major consciousness, which is a very big step that is almost unattainable, outside of balance. And then there is the conscious, unconscious, superconscious, and subconscious, right? Now, the subconscious is how you conduct yourself at work. Your consciousness is how you conduct yourself in a normal state. The subconscious is the acts that take place negatively without your current direction, right? Things that kind of just happen to you without you thinking of it. And the superconscious is you acting more in alignment with divinity, right? Being the perfect representative, which is why it is so obtainable, of the particular elements. This is a theory that was too much for most people. It is not included in this book, but it will be in the second edition, because that part was too much for most people who dealt with MBTI. But those four parts of the mind correspond with this, and that is why I'm pointing it out, right? The conscious, subconscious, superconscious, and unconscious are four parts of your mind that do work, that you do have access to, even if it takes a little bit of work to get there fully, right? And so this does, for me, come into perfect accordance with what I already understand. The problem of 3 and 4, Trinity and Quaternity, plays a great role in alchemy as the axiom of Maria. 497. In this connection, the alchemist only mentioned the 3 men in the fiery furnace. What's that got to do with Maria? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, they were joined by the Holy Spirit inside of the fire. Go back to Daniel. There's some good lessons to be learned from Daniel, even if he was probably not actually Jewish. And, like the vision of Ezekiel, is concerned with the God image. The symbols of the self are, as a rule, symbols of a totality, but this is only occasionally true of God images. In the former, the circle and the quaternary predominate. In the latter, the circle and the trinity. And this, moreover, only in the case of abstract representations, which are not the only ones to occur. These hints may throw a little light on the strange idea of the serpent chariot. It is a symbol of the arcane substance and the quintessence of the ether that contains all 4 elements, and at the same time a God image, or, to be more accurate, an image of the anima mundi. This is indicated by the mercurial serpent, which, in its turn, was interpreted by the alchemist as the spirit of life that was in the wheels. 498. 498 is the Vulgate from Ezekiel, Psychology and Alchemy. Now, remember we were talking about the wheels within, right? Those 7 internal wheels, the 1 external. The spirit of life is in those. We should also mention that according to Ezekiel 1:18, the inter-revolving wheels were full of eyes round about. The old illustrators therefore produced something like an astrolabe in their attempts to depict the vision. The notion of wheels is naturally connected with movement in all directions, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro through the whole earth. Zechariah 4:10. It is said of the horses, too, that they walk to and fro the earth. Zechariah 6:7. Eyes are round, and in common speech are likened to cartwheels. Now, that is not a natural assumption to make. Your eyes are not round, right? They are. The actual physical eye is literally a sphere with a little bit extra on the back end, so it's not quite a perfect sphere, but it's fairly close. It is close enough to be understood. But in order to understand that, you have to remove them. They have to come out of the occipital lobe. You cannot look at this and not see an oval, right? Even if I open them as wide as possible, it is still an oval. It is not round. They also seem to be a typical symbol for what I have called the multiple luminosities of the unconscious. And I'm going to expand upon that because it just hit me. It just hit me. what this wheel and within wheels. Oh my God. Okay, so one of the things that has recently happened to me is I have gotten a greater understanding of some of my own peccadillos, right? I have something that is called a phantasia. I have not the capacity to close my eyes and envision willfully anything. That is something that has afflicted me for my entire life. I have recently been able to intentionally visualize colors. But in the process of discovery, here in the last, it's been 2 weeks now, I discovered that my hands, having those chakras that we discussed being attached to the heart, is like a focusing device for this. And in the meditative, well, in the prayer state coming out of meditation, when you are working, if you are moving the energies, it's not meditation, it is prayer. If you are moving, thinking, or doing intentionally, it is not meditation. But in the prayer state out of meditation, on the back side of it, when I move the energies in that state, I discovered that what I can do with these things is clarify my third eye. Right now, I did that by putting my hands here and intentionally moving the energy from both equally, not absorbing, but giving out the positive flexion. And depending on where I place it, right? If I go a little bit closer or a little bit farther away, whether I turn it, whether they are aligned correctly with the correct position for the chakras, right? This is intentionally dependent upon that. I can move that field. Now, what used to appear to me was like static, constantly moving black flakes and white flakes in no particular pattern whatsoever. What I discovered was that they are actually representations of the harmonics of magnetics. That what I can do with this, by clarifying it, going in and out and moving that energy through the eye, I can clear that field into a Vesica Pisces. That Vesica Pisces looks like your eyes. All right, your eyes are the shape of a Vesica Pisces, if you were unaware. Right, now, we're not going to get into the sacred geometry today. This is part of sacred geometry. That Vesica Pisces is represented in the middle by a combination of two colors. Here it's going to be blue, blue indigo. It's going to be indigo, right? And so on one side of that is a very bright side of indigo, and on the other side is a very dark side of indigo. But in the middle, in a perfect sphere, is the combination of the two in perfect accordance and balance, right? If you are moving the hands correctly. And so, this Vesica Pisces understanding on the wheel now makes sense to me, whereas it didn't really before. That is entirely allegorical. That is not physicality. But that understanding of these Vesica Pisces being the predominant makeup of these wheels absolutely makes sense to me in light of my understanding. That does not mean necessarily that it is a fully correct one, but it is one that I don't have control over, right? Whenever I did this and I clarified into the Vesica Pisces, it was like watching the waves on water come into coherence, right? Whereas there was a multitude of ripples, it isolated it into a single source of ripples, bringing into accordance into these card wheels. And that is entirely, right, that is well into my realm of speculation, things that I talk about that nobody else does. So, all right. They also seem to be a typical symbol for what I have called the multiple luminosities of the unconscious. To me, that is also going to be multiple luminosities, things that glow. Luminosities of the unconscious. By this, I mean the seeming possibility that complexes possess a kind of consciousness, a luminosity of their own, which I conjecture expresses itself in the symbol of the soul spark, multiple eyes, and the starry heaven. 499. On the nature of the psyche. By reason of its solar nature, the eye is a symbol of consciousness, and accordingly multiple eyes would indicate a multiplicity of conscious centers which are coordinated into a unity like the many-faceted eye of an insect. As Ezekiel's vision can be interpreted psychologically as a symbol of the self, we may also mention in this connection the Hindu definition of the self. Here, Hiranya Yagambara as the collective aggregate of all individual souls, 500. Ramanuja's commentary on the Vedanta Sutras. And again, right, to me, the one is the collective aggregate of all individualized souls. Right, so this does not directly contradict anything that I already believe. I believe that the higher understanding comes from this conscious collectiveness, right? There is a collective consciousness. It is sometimes called the Akashic Records, where your experience is recorded when you die on the electromagnetics of creation. You have access to it. I have seen it. I have not extracted from it. That is something that I am going to have to return to one day, I guess. But as of now, I have not, right, intentionally, I have not gone back to that particular thing. But I do believe that there is this collective aggregate of individual souls. I believe that that is the divine, that we are individualized from the divine, and that the collection would be the divine. Back to the text. Ezekiel's vision of psychological importance, because the quaternity embodied it, is the vehicle or throne of him who had the appearance of a man. Together with the spirit of life in the wheels, it represents the empirical self, the totality of the four functions. These four are only partly conscious. The auxiliary functions are partly, and the inferior or subliminal function is wholly autonomous. They cannot be put to conscious use, and they reach consciousness only indirectly as a fait accompli, through their sometimes disturbing effects. Their specific energy adds itself to the normal energy of the unconscious and thereby gives it an impulse that enables it to erupt spontaneously into consciousness. As we know, these invasions can be observed systematically in the association experiment. 501. My analysis on the associations of an epileptic. The quaternity of the self appears in Ezekiel's vision as the true psychological foundation of the God concept. God uses it as his vehicle. It is possible for the psychologist to verify the structure of this foundation, but beyond that, the theologian has the last word. In order to clear up any misunderstandings, especially from the theological side, I would like to emphasize yet again that it is not the business of science to draw conclusions which go beyond the bounds of our empirical knowledge. Leave that for people like me, who is exploring the spirituality side of it. Right? I acknowledge the physical side of it. My interest is on the other side. I do not feel the slightest need to put self in the place of God. I don't either. Right? You are the individualized section of God that is having the experience. That does not put you in the place of God. You are a representative of God, but so is every single other person on the planet at all times. I do not feel the slightest need to put the self in the place of God, as short-sighted critics have often accused me of doing. And that is the thing, man. Right? When I say that I don't comport to Christianity, what is the question that gets asked? Are you anti-Christ? Well, not really. Not in the definition of the Bible at all. Right? I believe in the teachings of Christ, just not necessarily how they were recorded, not how they were conveyed, not how they were portrayed, right? But the actual physical workings of Christ was to go out and heal people, to go out and feed people, to go out and help people. I have no problem with that whatsoever. If you follow the words written in red, you're probably going to be all right. It's all the other stuff that gets attached with it that causes all of the problems. Right now, that is only an understanding of the creation through the lens of Christianity. There was a whole nother one that was called Judaism. There's another one that is called Islam. There's another one that is called Buddhism. There's a wide variety of understandings of the creation. Mine is a little bit different than many people's, but It is not replacing God, right? It is not stepping into an antichrist role. I'm not here to bring about the destruction of anything. I am here honestly seeking and serving the Spirit, trying to show you that you don't need any of them control systems whatsoever. I am not even necessarily creating a control system other than the fact that all you need is God himself. But this is what you will get, right? This is what I get. I got it from my own dad this week, right? Because it came up. He was trying to use the Bible as a reference for something topical, and I'm like, you can't do that. That's just not an understanding that is part of the Bible. You don't understand what you are talking about, and you are completely misportraying it. And that got into a discussion about these things. And he's like, well, what are you, an antichrist? No, I am pro-God. I am pro-spirit. And so that sets me against Christ as the Word. That sets me against as Christ as the redemptive element. That sets me against the blood sacrifice being necessary because I represent God for himself. Fully capable, fully able to forgive you without requiring a blood sacrifice at all. Back to the text. If Indian philosophers equate the Atman with the concept of God, and many Westerners copy them, this is simply their subjective opinion and not science. And again, I maintain how often speculation. I have written it in a book. I firmly and fully believe it. It is speculation unless it can be proved by others. Right? Even the things that I firmly and emphatically believe in, I leave in the realm of speculation because it is subjective. I portray it when I'm doing my videos on my channel in a way that is somewhat decisive. But even then, I will often say it is speculative. It is in the realm of speculation. It is not confirmed. Take it with a grain of salt. Anything along those lines, right? A consensus generalis on this point would in itself be yet another fact which, for the empirical psychologist, is as well worth considering as the remarkable view of many theologians that religious statements have nothing to do with the psyche. Similarly, it is characteristic of the mystical philosophy of the alchemists that the mercurial serpent is enthroned on the chariot. He is a living spirit who uses his body, his chariot. He is a living spirit who uses as his chariot the body that consists of the four elements. In this sense, the chariot is a symbol of earthly life. A Georgian fairy tale closes with the verses. I have dragged a cot up the mountain. It has become like a mountain. Summon me from this life over to eternity. 502. That is the bald-headed goose herd. Very interesting. As I have said, the process of transformation does not come to an end with the production of the quaternity symbol. The continuation of the opus leads to the dangerous crossing of the Red Sea, signifying death and rebirth. It is very remarkable that our author, by his paradox, running without running, moving without motion, introduces a coincidence of opposites just at this point, and that the Hippolytus text speaks, equally paradoxically, of the gods of destruction and the god of salvation being together. Both of those are in accordance with the balancing that I talk about in this book. The quaternity, as we have seen, is a quartino of opposites, a synthesis of the four originally divergent functions. Their synthesis is achieved in an image, but in psychic reality, becoming conscious of the whole psyche, faces us with a highly problematical situation. Footnote 503. Whole is meant here only in a relative sense, implying merely the most important aspects of the individual psyche and of the collective unconscious. We can indicate its scope in a single question. What am I to do with the unconscious? Assimilate it. Identify, learn, and assimilate it. Right? You have unconscious functions. That is true. Whenever something occurs in your life and you get mad, that is an unconscious function. That is an imbalance towards wrath. Right? That is what getting mad is. That is an unconscious function of an imbalance signified by your base chakra, which is love and wrath. There is a balance to be stricken between those, and that balance is kindness. You should treat every human as though they were a child of God, because they are. And so you should be kind to them. That is one of the first fundamental concepts of balance that we talk about, right? And again, I didn't get into the kindness part of the balance. I just said to balance it. Now I have definitions better. Second edition is going to be much more inclusive. What am I to do with the unconscious? Learn to identify when those triggers happen. What made me mad? Why am I having this response? What is the appropriate response? How can I refer to this with kindness? How can I look at this in a different light? That is what you are to do with the unconscious. To assimilate it within yourself, learn to identify those triggers and bring those triggers into accordance with your desires. And that is not base level sexual desires, hunger, or anything like that. That is the desires of your soul to come into accordance. Back to the text. For this, unfortunately, there are no recipes or general rules. I disagree. I have a rule book. Again, I know that sounds awfully prideful, but I have spent a considerable amount of time. Most of the temptations of man can be decided by the 7 virtues and vices, right? You can envy as a function of pride. That is you wanting things. That is envy, right? That is not a vice in and of itself. It is a function of another vice. Sexual desires, right, is a function of lust. Not necessarily the entirety of lust. There are other things that are included in that as well. But pretty much anything that you are facing, and I've spent a considerable amount of time thinking about it, right? Pretty much anything that you can face can be broken down into one of the 7 dipoles. These 7 things to balance, right? Love and wrath, chastity and lust, greed and denial, or no, greed and charity. This is gluttony and denial. This is pride and humility. This is sloth and diligence. This is faith and hope. Pretty much any part of the human experience that is either a temptation towards the negative or towards the positive can be broken down into that furtherance of the categories that are defined here. I have not found anything that is outside of them. If it was, I would have tried to fit it in as another chakra, right? But it doesn't. It fits fairly well. I have not found anything that fits outside of it. So there are general rules, right? And even with what am I to do with the unconscious, there is a general rule. Identify the negative emotions so that you can change them into the positive ones that you actually want. That is the general rule. Back to the text. I have tried to present the main outlines of what these psychotherapists can observe of this wearisome and all too familiar process in my study, the relations between the ego and the unconscious. For the layman, these experiences are a terra incognita, which is not made any more accessible by broad generalizations. Even the imagination of the alchemist, otherwise so fertile, fails us completely here. Once again, I will refer you to my own book. I do mental alchemy, right? I am not yet really, this is alchemy. I am combining a variety of things into a beneficial potion for me to imbibe. So this is alchemy. But I'm not really doing alchemy out there. I am doing mental alchemy. I have affected physical change in my literal body through the manipulation and the balance of these things. I do not speak of these things idly. I have spent a considerable amount of time in consideration of them. Only a thorough investigation of the text could shed a little light on this question. And that is because of something we have talked about in the study, right? That not everybody knew what they were talking about. Agrippa had no idea. Crowley had no idea. Paracelsus, it appears, did not have a great idea, right? I haven't done his work, so I cannot say definitively like I can for Agrippa, right? Agrippa had no clue what he was talking about. He was merely relaying information from someone else. Same thing as Solomon did in the Proverbs. The same task challenges our endeavors in the field of psychotherapy. Here, too, are thousands of images, symbols, dreams, fantasies, and visions that still await comparative research. The only thing that can be said with some certainty at present is that there is a gradual process of approximation whereby the two positions, the conscious and unconscious, are both modified. Differences in individual cases, however, are just as great as they were among the alchemists. And that is going to bring us to the end of this part, right? I forget what it was named. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. I understand that I do hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. I am attempting to bring a greater understanding. I know that that sounds prideful, but I come with as much humility as I can possibly muster. I have balanced myself. It was an extreme big deal for me to step out on this limb, for me to put myself and my beliefs out here as firmly and as concretely as I have done today is a big deal for me. This is not something that is intrinsically natural to me. If you remember, I just described my stack, right? It is NIFE. NI is making everything go into the proper box for an idea, right? If you give me an idea, I'll be like, oh, that comports with this. We do that all the way through this. But the FE part of that is me feeling responsible for how other people feel. It is me being responsible for correcting ethics, but it is also me being responsible for how other people feel. There is no part of this that I do not expect Christians to not get offended at. I know, right? I have unconventional beliefs. I do not believe that Jesus was the redemptive savior of mankind for reasons that are outlined in the Bible study, right? I do not believe that he was the physical representation of the Logos for reasons that I have outlined in this study and the Bible study and this book and pretty much everything that we go through. It is vitally important to the point of being my mission here on earth to talk about these things, to reveal the higher path through my understanding. I have affected physical change in my life. I have done literal magic. Now, I understand that that is too much for people. I understand that that steps on toes. It is extremely hard for me to step on them toes. It's one of the reasons why I'm so emphatic about I do not apologize for it, because if I am led to reveal the truth, then I have to do that even if it pisses you off. I have to do that if it steps on your toes. I have to do that if it steps on my own toes. And I have several times. And that's where we're going to leave this one. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book, consulting me directly for a consultation, or hitting that hype button, which is entirely free. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.